Well, the topic that I'll be talking about here for the next few minutes is setting realistic goals for growing your operation. And it's an interesting fact of life that either you're moving forward or you die, right? Western AgCredit, we feel the same pressure to grow as most people in agriculture, because if you don't grow, then your expenses start to become unmanageable. You become less and less relevant in your business sphere. But yet it has to be managed growth. As a financial institution, there's a very kind of narrow window of growth that's optimum. If you grow too slow, then your expense rates creep up on you and you become uncompetitive. If you grow too fast, then you outstrip your capital and you don't have enough reserves to get you through the tough times. And for our institution, that window is like on the low side. If we're growing less than 2% over a period of time, then we become less and less competitive. If we grow over 5%, then we very quickly overextended our capital. And so it's kind of a small window there that we try to manage over the course of time to stay financially strong and relevant in the marketplace. Well, people in agriculture face a particular pressure to grow, and what would some of the factors be? What are some of the pressures that you're feeling that think, well, maybe I need to step it up a notch in order to survive? Can you think of another industry that has higher fixed costs than agriculture? When you look at the cost of equipment, the cost of land, relative to the revenue you can generate from those assets, I don't know that there's too many industries out there that have such a high burden on fixed costs. How do you manage fixed costs? You got to have more units to spread them over, don't you? You got to have more ways to allocate those costs. Just to give you a personal example, when I was a youngster growing up here in Lake Shore, our farm consisted of 40 acres. Del Monte had a cannery just down the road here. The sugar company had a plant down here in Leland, and there were quite a few options for a person in agriculture in those days. Our farm, we had a field of sugar beets, we had some sweet corn, we raised peas, we raised some lima beans, we raised carrots and onions, and you keep a few animals on the place. And on 40 acres, you could generate enough income to just about support a family. Nowadays, 40 acres, you can't turn your tractor around in it. We had state-of-the-art tractors, an International H and an International M, and boy, they sure beat horses for pulling the plow and pulling the harrow. But compared to today's equipment, you'd go broke in a hurry because you couldn't get over the land quick enough. So here's what's going on when you're in agriculture. Costs over time tend to increase faster than the price you get for your product, don't they? And I can remember my dad saying many times over the course of the years that he says, I'm not getting any more for my crops now than I did 20 years ago. And you'll go through times in the business cycle that's true. And but yet your costs don't do that, do they? Your costs only go one direction. The price you get for your product goes like this, but costs just go like that over time. So you need to spread your high fixed costs over more units. That sounds better, doesn't it? More units per acre, more animals and whatnot. And here's something that's getting more and more important. You got to produce enough product to be able to market it. And a lot of buyers of product now, they require you to be able to fill a certain market or to provide certain quantities in order to attract the best price. And here's a big one too. People in agriculture are hoping that they're developing something they can pass on to the next generation. Every dad wants one of his sons to continue on with the farm, doesn't he? But at some point in time, you got to bring that additional family member on, and so now there's another household to feed, and you got to increase your income to take care of that additional family. Well, the fact is that healthy, viable operations commonly have a methodical, planned approach to growth in order to meet their long-range goals and needs. So the trick is, how do you do that in such a way that it makes sense in terms of what we talked about this morning and keeping yourself in line financially. So we're going to talk about a couple of approaches to growth. Carefully planned growth, it can strengthen the operation over time. You gain those efficiencies, and at the same time, where it's carefully planned, along the way you make sure that you have plenty of reserves to get through those down cycles that always happen in agriculture. Poorly planned growth, you're not as protected financially during times of adversity. You have unexpected management challenges, and the benefits that you hope to get were not realistic, and so the cost and prices don't meet your expectations. Now there's something here that I've observed over the years when somebody wants to grow their operation. There's a logical, methodical approach to it, and then there's the emotional components that come into play. The emotional reasons for expansion. Have you ever heard this? They're not making any more of it, particularly in terms of real estate, so I need to buy before prices get even higher. Does that sound like a business approach or more of an emotional approach to want to grow? If somebody comes into me and says, I got to buy that real estate next to me, they're not making any more of it, and it's only going to get more expensive. I thought, you just haven't been around long enough. Even real estate goes through times like this. And if that's your reason for expanding, you better have thought through some other things, because that in and of itself will get you into trouble. Another emotional reason is that land used to be grandpa's and I want to get it back into family. Or if I don't buy now, I may never get another chance. Or there's a new normal. This is something that we've seen a lot in the last few years, and I'll get into that a little bit more a little later on in my presentation. We won't experience the same lows in prices that we've had in the past. We've reached some new plateaus now. The game's changed. The pitfalls to emotional motivators is that we tend to jump in at the top of the business cycle when there's a lot of excitement. Most of the interest we get for new loans happens when the business cycle's at the top. We don't get nearly as many inquiries for loans when prices are low. And there's a reason for that. And there's a logical reason. When prices are high, you want to get in before they get even higher, right? So you want to jump in before you totally lose your opportunity. When prices are low, you're afraid because they might go even lower, right? You don't know if you're at the bottom yet. And incidentally, that's one of the things that the Federal Reserve is most concerned about when you talk about the national economy. They're more afraid of deflation than anything, because when prices start to decrease, that will freeze up the economy quicker than anything, because people stop buying. They say, why should I buy something today when it's going to be cheaper tomorrow? And it can freeze up the economy. And so they try to manage a certain level of inflation to keep us spending our money, to keep us buying, keep the economy going. That same philosophy kind of ties into this this aspect. You base your reason to get in based on a continuation of these high prices we're seeing. You think, well, at $3 calves, I can obviously afford to buy more $2,800 cows. Good grief, that calf will pay for that cow in 1 or 2 years. Why not do it? That's not a realistic expectation that prices are always going to stay that high. And you tend to minimize the costs and management demands that this expansion might bring about. When you're running an operation at a certain level and you've learned how to manage it efficiently, you take on you take a big jump, and all of a sudden it's not about just driving the tractor. You've got to hire help, and you've got to do this, and you've got to get equipment from place to place. All of a sudden there's a whole new set of management demands that you underestimated how much stress, and you're relying more on other people who don't have the same level of interest that you do to make things work. And you base your decisions on short-term rather than long-term factors. You're thinking short-term and not long-term. The more logical approach to expansion, you've analyzed this carefully enough that by doing what you propose to do, this acquisition will show a reasonable rate of return based on long-term conditions. And that's been emphasized this morning and again this afternoon. The efficiencies gained will offset the cost. It improves your break-even. It doesn't increase your break-even. And you will retain enough reserves to get through the tough times. Expansion always comes with unexpected problems, and it can put extra stress on your financial reserves. And a well-planned expansion will make sure you have plenty there for contingencies to get you through the difficult times. I can't tell you how many times we've seen somebody undergo a large expansion, and right out of the gate they're having problems. And it sometimes takes years to get things stabilized again, and all of the pressure that puts on a person. A logical approach to expansion is part of a long-term business plan. It's not something that you decided to do spur of the moment. You have thought about where you want to be 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, and 20 years from now, and you've laid out a plan, and you've prepared yourself so that when those opportunities come, you've got the means to take those steps. It's part of a long-range plan. Now, a lot was said this morning about the commodity cycle, and this is just a real simple illustration. Why is it in agriculture there's cycles like this? More so than most other industries. Here's some
simple economic principle: supply and demand.
Supply and demand. And what are agriculture producers the best in the world at doing?
Oversupply.
Oversupply, right?
So, when there's a profit, we produce more so we get the profit. When there's no profit, we produce more so we can pay the bills.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the time intervals, the business cycle will be from this point to this point, or from this point to this point, and it's different for each commodity depending on how quickly those commodities can respond to supply changes. In the cattle industry, historically, from peak to peak or trough to trough is 10 years, because it takes a long time to build up a cow herd, to get that calf to market, to retain heifers to build the herd, and then to shrink on the other side. It's a 10-year process to work through that on the cattle side. How about on the poultry side? A year or two, because the life cycle of a turkey or a chicken is a lot shorter than a cow, and you can get way more offspring per cycle. The same with hogs. And corn, how long did it take us to get from $7, $8 corn to $3, $4 corn? Yeah, 1 or 2 years of a big crop, and you're right there. You brought the price down. And so some commodities respond a lot quicker to the economic cycles than others. But the point is, over time, there will be a pattern like that. And it'll always be there. It will always be there in agriculture. It will never go away, for that simple reason, that we respond really well to market forces. When the prices are good, we expand. When the prices are poor, not everybody survives until supply gets back in balance with demand, and then you'll see the cycle start over again. This is something there's been a lot talked about. Every once in a while you'll reach the cycle won't look normal. In the last 8 or 10 years we've been in what the economists call a super cycle. It's not following that same normal pattern. And what a super cycle does is it has a distorted pattern for a period of time. This would apply to like cattle. You come out of here and prices reach the normal peak, but then instead of cycling back down, what happens? They continue to drift up, and then they might even go even higher than ever and stay there for a period of time. And what's the thinking that we kind of, it's human psychology to think that after something's been a certain way for a certain period of time, it's always going to stay that way. And so you psychologically you start to think, well, that's the way things are now. That's the way things are now. So, Mr. Crandall, if you were to have that way of thinking and made a big major decision based on this, it's always going to be there now, how would you be feeling over the last couple of months?
You'd be questioning your own judgment.
Yeah, you'd start to, reality would start to hit home. The cattle cycle hasn't been repealed. Congress hasn't done that yet, and Obama hasn't signed that legislation. And what happens after a super cycle is sometimes the adjustments can be even more harsh and more severe and take even longer to dig out of on the other end. Because when you go through a super cycle and you hit the crash on the other end, you've really traumatized people, because there's been a lot of money lost, and it takes a while for those players to get back into the market and to have confidence restored in the market. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing kind of the front end of that now. Cattle prices have recovered quite a bit the last couple of weeks from that steep drop they took in September, October. But still, it's kind of a reminder, isn't it, that things can change, and they can change very quickly. And that this idea that there's a new normal, if that's what you're basing your decision on, there's a high probability that you'll get yourself in trouble. Some of the commodities that we're seeing the downside of that super cycle was mentioned this morning. Hay. Hay's been up in $200 a ton range for how many years? Several years. And so you start to think it's always going to be there. And so people go pay down in Delta, land that's been for how many odd years, 1,500 to 2,000 an acre for, gosh, the first 30 years of my career. Now you go down there, and because hay prices have been up for so long, what does farm ground in Delta cost now? 5,000 or 6,000, right? When hay gets back down to $125 and stays there for a while, the person that paid that $6,000 an acre for the ground is going to have to have some staying power to get through the low times, right? Mink is not a common commodity throughout the state, but it is in our Spanish Fork office. We have quite a number of mink clones. That super cycle was classic to the mink. For 5 years in a row, they made money like never before. And all of a sudden, in 1 year, prices have collapsed by more than half, and you cannot sell a mink pelt today for more than what it costs to produce. Every skin you send to market is going to lose you money. And that's kind of a hard pill to swallow. And you just hope you have enough reserve to outlast the other guy, so you're there when prices start to come back up. Is that interesting at all, or? I mentioned this, that most interesting growing and operation occurs at the cycle peaks. Need to move before prices get higher. High commodity prices will still be around for a while. There's lots of buying and selling activity. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of things, and everybody else is making their move. Maybe I better jump in too. A few slides back when I said planned growth is methodical and it's part of a long-range plan. And if that's the case and you've planned for that growth, you're in a position to take advantage of those opportunities when they come. And it might be at the upper part of the cycle, it might be at the lower, but where you've laid away the reserves and you planned for it, you're not going to get burned as hard. Where you're at on the cycle becomes less relevant. It's like trying to time the stock market. When you try to jump in when it's low and sell when it's high, you have to be right twice in order to have a chance at it. And most of us are not that smart. But if it's part of a long-range plan and you've laid away the reserves to make your next step, if you're paying a little bit more than the market at the time, it's not going to be that relevant. As I mentioned, we see the most interest in new loans at the peak of the cycle. The super cycle, we talked about that. The peaks and the troughs last much longer. The thinking sets in that this is the new normal, but the dips can be much steeper and more severe when the market correction occurs, and the recovery can take a lot longer. And we talked about cattle, hay, and mink, what's been going on there. Now, there's another thing I want to just mention. When you talk about expanding, the primary motivator, if you're looking at this on a non-emotional level, is that I'm trying to become more efficient. And efficiency is reflected in your break-even. Can you produce your product cheaper than your neighbor and cheaper than your peers? And if you look at this normal cycle that I put up there, if the industry break-even is this blue line here, that's right in the middle of those cycles, isn't it? That means that, and these would be the commodity prices going up and down. If your break-even is the industry average, then that means that over time, the years that you make money are going to be offset by the years that you lose money, and over time, you get nowhere. Who wants to work for nothing? I had an old nursery account early on in my career, and I was trying to talk this guy into expanding because he just sold his nursery product just out of his front door. And I says, you know, you ought to try to get into some retail outlets and expand your markets. And he says, I know too many nurseries that have done that, and they end up working for nothing because they drive your margins down so low. And he says, if I'm going to work for nothing, I'd rather go fishing. And I thought, you know, that's not a bad philosophy in life. If you can't do this and make money. Another example is I had a fellow that I respected very dearly who's passed away now that was in the cattle business, cattle feeder and had a cow herd. And one year he made a lot of money feeding cattle. And I says, what you going to do with all that money? And he says, oh, it belongs to the cows, and one of these days they're going to want it back. And so he understood the nature of these cycles, that when you have the good cycle, you better hang on to that for the ride through the down part. And the other thing he said is, I don't have to own it if it's not going to make me money. And if you don't remember anything else that I say in my presentation, that is something that will save your bacon. If it won't make me money, I don't have to own it. That takes the emotional motivators out of it. And so if that's the break-even line, where do you want your break-even line to be? On the graph up here, which color? Easy question. You want your break-even to be below the break-even, so that means that over time, yeah, you'll have some loss years, but the years that you make money will exceed the years that you lose money, and so over time you'll make progress. You'll get ahead. So if you're thinking about an expansion or growing your operation, you want to look at the figures close enough that if I do this, what's it going to do to this line here? What do you want it to do if you expand? Which direction do you want that line to go? You want to drive it down, right? You want your break even to go even lower. Otherwise, why do it? What's the reason? Why do you want to do it if it's only going to push your break even higher? And so using that information we talked about this morning and here, when you come in and talk to one of us and say, I want to grow my operation and I want to do this, I want to do that, we go through those budgets that Robert showed us, and we go through your financial projections. If it doesn't leave you better off, if it doesn't make you more efficient, if it doesn't push your break even down, then why do you want to do it? The only reason you might want to do it is because there are some other important reasons for buying that ground next door, whatever. You need that buffer. You don't want neighbors that are bothered by flies and odors or whatever. But you darn better have enough margin in your core operation that you can afford to do it and still have some cushion to get you through. Now, I've got just a real simple illustration here. And what I want you to get from this little exercise is just the idea that we look at the before and after impact it has on your balance sheet when you decide to grow, when you decide to take on another obligation. So I'm going to walk you through just quickly a couple of key things to look at. This will be a test on what Robert and Burke taught you this morning. So we're going to see how well you did. Okay, this is just a made-up financial statement. I just pulled some figures up. You'll recognize on the right-hand side, Robert taught you that those are your assets. On the left-hand side, those are your debts. And so, can you see this okay? Is it big enough? What's this? Your working capital, right? Who can tell me where this number comes from? Point me on the chart where your debt, where this 40,000 comes from. Anybody brave enough to make a guess?
Current assets minus debt.
Okay, we got it. You take your current assets, 110, and your current debt is 70. What's 110 minus 70? Voila, your magic. That's the 40,000. Your net worth of 472, I want you to remember that number. That's just your total assets minus your total debt. And I've used a little different terminology for your ownership. I've called it your percent equity. And so you own 60% of your assets, which is just your percentage of your net worth compared to your total assets. So just remember those numbers, okay? 40,000, the net worth of 472, percent equity of 60%. Okay, so here's what happens. I have some income figures there at the top that are too faded, you couldn't see them. But that $40,000 of working capital, I'm going to put this in Dave Ramsey terms. According to the estimated operating expenses I had on there in debt service, that $40,000 will last you for 7 months. Now, would Dave Ramsey be proud of you if you had 7 months worth of reserves sitting in the bank? What? Yeah, he would. Yeah, even Dave Ramsey would be happy about that. Okay, it's very unlikely in agriculture that you would have a single event that would wipe out 7 months worth of working capital. Rarely occurs. Could, but probably not likely. So just remember that. So you got a good fallback position based on that financial statement to take a blow if something doesn't work. If the commodity prices drop, if you have a crop failure, disease problem, all those things that agriculture is subject to, you'd get by okay. You got enough reserves to do that. That 60% equity means you can go back to Western AgCredit if you have a little problem, say, I need to borrow a little bit more to get through a tough time. Could we do it? Yeah, we could. You still got some lending power before the bank becomes the senior partner, right? Okay. Plan D is the one that we all try to avoid, which is default. We don't like it. You don't like it. We try to avoid it at all costs. We don't like to default loans. We don't like to foreclose on things. We do not like to have people go through that foreclosure. We have very rare instances of that ever happening. So your plan A is that your plan works. Your plan B is you have enough working capital to get you through without interrupting your operation. Plan C is that if I have to, I can go back to the bank and borrow my way through a temporary problem. Plan D is default. It's kind of like when you go to buy a gun safe Do you want to buy the one that has a 30-minute fire rating, a 60-minute fire rating, or a 90-minute fire rating? You don't want to burn through everything until you get to the D. Okay, so the 50 acres next door to you has come up for sale. It's $5,000 an acre. So here's what you're thinking. You hate to see someone buy the property and be a bad neighbor, right? Well, I mean, that's very common, right? I'm not making fun of that, it's just a reality. It probably won't be available again for another generation. Land doesn't trade hands that often, particularly the one next door to you. It'll provide some extra room to run my cows. And, you know, that's a good reason. Put a pencil to it and see how much that's really worth. And someday it may grow houses, making it a good investment for my children or grandchildren. What's the problem with that one? Someday, and between now and someday, you got to pay for it. You have to pay for it. Okay, so here's what happens after you buy that piece of ground. What's happened to working capital? It's gone. What was the working capital before? What is it now? What happened to it? There was $20,000 up here that you used for a down payment on the ground. You financed the rest, and part of that financing includes the current portion of the payment due that Robert talked about that's due this year. You have a payment that will be due this year when you take out that loan. So between the down payment and the first year's payment, it's taken $35,000 of your working capital to buy that. How come your net worth hasn't changed? You bought this piece of ground, how come your net worth didn't go up? You don't have any equity in it. You've used some cash and some debt, and so all you've done is change the composition of your assets and liabilities, but it hasn't affected your net worth. It's still the same, right? What happened to your percent ownership? What was it before? 60, and what is it now? Okay, that 15,000 will last you 2 months. The 40,000 would last you 7 months. Would Dave Ramsey be proud of you now? Probably not. Because it's very common in agriculture to have an event that will wipe out a couple of months worth of working capital. Can you go to the bank and say, I've had a problem, I need to borrow some more to get through this time? Maybe, but it's going to be a little tougher, isn't it? Are you closer to Plan D than you were before? Do you have as many firewalls to burn through before you have some serious problems? Those are just some things you need to think of when you think about if I construct a balance sheet after I want to make this acquisition or do this growth, am I still going to be safe? Am I still going to have those firewall protections to help me if things don't go right? This is just a real simple example just to kind of illustrate that. But you don't want to put sound planning means that you'll whenever you expand, you will expend some of your working capital in all likelihood. But you'll still have ample working capital left over after you've done what you want to do. And here's one that I just really believe strongly in. You never want to play all your cards. You always want to have another card up your sleeve that if things don't work, I still have a way out. I still have one more thing I can play. As soon as you played all your cards, if the first little thing goes wrong, then you're in trouble. And you really have no way out, short of selling your assets, shrinking your business, or those unpleasant things that are going to backfire on you. You always want to have options you can fall back on, short of selling assets or getting out of business. And here again, just to reinforce the point that was talked about this morning, you always want to use projections that are supported by long-term history. If you're making a long-term decision, you need it to be supported by long-term factors, or you'll run into problems. Now, just a statement or two on WAC to finish up here. As part of our credit philosophy, you can't be in the business of loaning to agriculture and be a high leverage lender because of the things we've talked about. There's just too much volatility, and I like to just kind of joke with my customers that you're in a business that one or two things can go right and about this many things can go wrong. Weather, bugs, early frost. I mean, there's just so many things that can go wrong. And the only two things that can go right is that you get good production and you get a good price. You might get good production but a bad price. The price might be good but you got no production. And so there's just all these things that can work against you. And so for us, we call it constructive lending. We don't want to loan people into trouble. And if we make a loan, it's with the high probability that it will be in your best interest, that it will increase your profitability and your goals without exposing you and Western AgCredit to unreasonable risk. And I hope that the tone of this hasn't been that when you come in and ask a proposal to grow your operation, we're going to try to throw cold water on it. No, but we will maybe be that sounding board that's bring a little more of the logic into the discussion and a little less of the emotion, and just to make sure that together as partners, we can help each other arrive at the best solution to what you're proposing to do. We are all for growth. We are all for becoming more efficient. In fact, as Western AgCredit's grown over the years, when I started in 1980, we were about a $100 million company. Now we're between 700 and 800 million. Where did all that growth come from? It's from the guys that have stayed in business over the years. Most of it's been organic growth from our existing customers as they've grown their operations over the years. Yeah, we've taken on new customers as we've gone along, but the lion's share of our growth has been from people who've grown their businesses along with ours. And it's been satisfying to me. I started out as a wet, behind the ears youngster in this business and seen my peers grow their operations over the years as my careers progressed along with them. Planned growth, organized growth, well thought out growth is necessary and essential for agriculture as a whole.